Clara Voss thought she knew every shadow in her childhood home until the night she saw her mother climb into the attic on all fours, her joints bending the wrong way, and heard a second set of footsteps follow her down. The house I grew up in stood alone at the end of a dirt road that seemed to stretch forever into the woods. No neighbors, no passing cars, just silence, except for the wind that rattled the loose shutters and the occasional groan of the old wood settling at night. My mother said that's how it had to be. She told me the world beyond our yard was full of danger, full of people who would hurt us if they could. She always spoke in a voice so calm it almost sounded like she was reciting something rehearsed, but her eyes were like cold glass. Whenever she looked at me that way, my thoughts froze, and any urge to ask questions disappeared. She had rules I could never break. I wasn't to leave the yard, not even to wander into the trees. I wasn't to open the windows after dark. And I was never, under any circumstance, to go into the attic. I followed those rules because I thought they were for my safety. But as I grew older, I began to feel like they were there for another reason, one she wouldn't tell me. She had habits that unsettled me. At night, I would sometimes wake up to find her standing in the corner of my room. She would just stand there, not moving, her face hidden in the shadows. I would shut my eyes and pretend to sleep, feeling her gaze on me until, eventually, she would leave. Her bare feet made no sound on the creaky floorboards, as though she had learned to move in a way that didn't disturb the house. One night a sound woke me, faint scraping from somewhere above. The attic, it wasn't the kind of noise a house makes when it settles. This was steady, deliberate. Something was being dragged. I lay there listening, my heart thudding in my ears. Then came the softest thump, followed by a long pause. I pulled the blanket over my head and held my breath. The next morning I found the ladder to the attic leaning against the wall in the hallway. It was old and splintered, but I'd never seen it out before. I stared at it for a long time before my mother's voice snapped me out of it. She was in the kitchen, humming a tune I didn't recognize. Her hands were wet, as though she had been washing them, but there were no dishes in the sink. The smell of damp earth lingered faintly in the air. That day I tried to keep busy, but I kept catching myself glancing toward the attic hatch. I told myself it was nothing, rats maybe, or a loose board shifting in the wind, but I couldn't shake the memory of that scraping sound. That night, it returned, louder this time. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting each scrape, each pause. Then came the breathing, slow, steady, muffled by the boards between us. I sat up, straining to hear, and realized it wasn't coming from directly above anymore. It was moving, toward the corner of my room. I froze, every muscle locked. I wanted to turn and look, but I couldn't. The air felt thicker, colder. Then, faintly, I heard footsteps in the hallway, my mother's slow, measured steps. My door creaked open just enough for her to peer in. I shut my eyes quickly, feigning sleep. I could feel her eyes on me for what felt like hours before she closed the door again. When morning came, she was gone, though the back door was locked from the inside. Muddy footprints led from the yard to the kitchen sink. They were smaller than her own. I crouched down, examining them, and noticed something strange. The toes were sharp, pointed, like claws had pressed into the floor instead of human feet. That night, the attic came alive again with scraping. It went on, faster than before, as if whatever was up there was desperate to get out. And somewhere in the darkness above, I thought I heard something else, something like a faint, wet whisper calling my name. I told myself not to think about the attic, but it was impossible. The sound had settled into my mind like a splinter I couldn't pull out. Every creak of the house made me tense. During the day, the attic was silent, but as soon as night came, the noise would return, scraping, dragging, then stillness, like whatever was up there was listening for me. One evening I noticed something new. The attic hatch, which was always shut tight, now hung slightly open. A wooden ladder leaned against it, angled in such a way that it seemed ready for use. I had never seen that ladder before, and the wood was wet, as if it had been left outside in the rain and dragged in only moments earlier. The hatch gaped just enough to show a strip of blackness, thick and impenetrable. I couldn't stop staring at it. That night, I tried to sleep, but every few minutes I found myself glancing at the ceiling. My heart jumped at each small noise wood settling, wind brushing against the walls, the faint ticking of the clock on my nightstand. I pulled the blanket up over my head, my breathing loud in my ears, and then I heard it. Breathing, slow, steady, heavy. At first, I thought it was coming from the attic again, but then I realized it was closer, much closer. The sound came from inside my room, low to the floor, just beyond my bed. I forced myself to lower the blanket enough to peek out, and in the faint light from the window, I saw a shape crouched near the foot of my bed. It was small, hunched, and entirely still. My body went cold. It wasn't my mother. The proportions were wrong, its arms were too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't make out a face, just a vague outline that pulsed with the rhythm of its breathing. I didn't dare move. My mind screamed for me to get up, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. Then, without warning, the figure jerked back, retreating into the shadows near the door. It scrambled with a strange insect-like quickness, and the moment it disappeared into the hallway, I heard footsteps, Not the frantic scuttling I'd just witnessed, but slow, deliberate steps, the ones I knew by heart. My mother's. She appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her hair hanging messily over her shoulders. Her eyes caught the faint light from outside, reflecting it in a way that made them look almost glassy. She just stood there for a moment, staring, and then turned away. As she left, I heard words in my head. Words telling me to stay in bed. But her lips had never moved. I stayed frozen long after she was gone. At some point, I realized the breathing had returned, this time above me. The attic, the scraping began again, faster now, more desperate. Each drag of whatever was moving up there made the ceiling shudder faintly. Eventually, exhaustion forced my eyes closed, though my mind was far from rest. I woke the next morning to find the attic hatch fully shut and the ladder gone. There was no sign of what had happened, no trace of the crouched figure or my mother's strange visit. I went to the kitchen for water, and that's when I saw it. The muddy footprints from before were back, trailing in from the yard. This time there were two sets. One was the small, clawed set I had seen earlier. The other was longer, thinner, with toes splayed unnaturally wide. They both stopped at the sink. I stood there for a long time, staring at those marks, listening to the silence of the house. My mother was outside, bent over in the garden. She moved slowly, digging into the soil with her bare hands, even though the ground was soaked from last night's rain. When she finally came back inside, she didn't look at me. She went straight to her room, closing the door behind her. A few minutes later I heard her voice. At first I thought she was speaking to me, but when I listened more closely, I realized she wasn't speaking to anyone I could see. The sound was coming from the attic. The house felt heavier after that night, as though the air itself had thickened. Every shadow seemed darker, every corner felt like it held something watching. I tried to keep to the parts of the house that felt safe, but the truth was there were none. The attic was above me no matter where I stood, and my mother's presence, when she was home, felt different, more distant, yet sharper, as if she was paying closer attention to me without ever meeting my eyes. By the third morning after the crouched figure appeared in my room, I couldn't take it anymore. My curiosity had grown into something ugly, something that felt more like desperation than simple wonder. I had to know what was happening in the house, and I had to know what my mother was hiding. Her bedroom was always locked, but I'd been planning for this. Weeks earlier, I had taken a bobby pin from the drawer in the hallway. I waited until she left to go into town, watching from the window until her figure vanished down the dirt road. Then I moved quickly. The lock gave way with surprising ease, and the door swung open to reveal a room that felt unnaturally bare. The bed was neatly made, untouched. The dresser drawers were empty. The walls were bare, except for faint scratches near the corners, like something had clawed at the plaster. My eyes drifted to the closet door. It stood slightly ajar, revealing nothing but darkness inside. When I pulled it open, the smell hit me, mold, wet soil, and something sharp and metallic beneath it. The floor of the closet was different from the rest of the house. It was rough wood, with a square outline cut into it, a trapdoor. I crouched and lifted it. Beneath was a narrow wooden staircase leading down into complete darkness. My pulse thudded in my ears as I descended. The air was damp and heavy, each breath tasting faintly of rust. At the bottom, my bare feet met packed earth. The room was small, no bigger than my bedroom. The walls were covered in deep, uneven scratch marks, some horizontal, some vertical, as if several sets of hands or claws had been here over time. In the center of the room sat a single wooden chair. Beneath it was a dark stain in the dirt, spreading outward like something had seeped there long ago. A faint sound made me turn. It was almost too soft to hear breathing. Again, I spun around, but there was no one in the room. The sound was close though, and it seemed to come from behind the wall itself. I backed away, my hands trembling. As I climbed the stairs, I thought I heard movement above me, coming from the attic. I froze halfway up. There was a creak directly overhead, then another, heavier this time. I moved faster, pushing the trapdoor open and stepping back into my mother's empty bedroom. When I emerged into the hallway, my breath caught. The front door was standing wide open. Rain poured outside, the gray sky pressing down on the trees. In the yard stood a figure, thin, still. Its hair hung in wet strands, covering its face. It swayed gently from side to side, as though in time with some unheard rhythm. I blinked, and it was gone. I stepped outside, searching the yard, but there was nothing. The only sound was the rain and the distant groan of the trees in the wind. My skin crawled, the sense of being watched growing heavier by the second. I backed into the house and locked the door, my hands shaking. That night, I heard my mother's voice again. It was coming from the attic, low and urgent. I pressed my ear to the ceiling and realized she wasn't speaking in a tone I'd ever heard before. It was fast, rhythmic, almost like chanting. And she wasn't alone. There was another voice. It was higher-pitched, rasping, and it spoke between her words, as if answering her. I couldn't make out what either of them was saying, but I knew, without question, that she wasn't talking to herself. Sleep had become impossible. Even when exhaustion finally dragged me under, I would wake moments later, heart racing, sure that something was moving in the dark. Every noise in the house now felt deliberate, the soft tap of wood in the walls, the slow creak of a floorboard far from where I lay. The air felt charged, as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for me to make a mistake. I started keeping my bedroom light on, but one night I woke to find the room dim. The bulb was gone, leaving the fixture empty. I sat up slowly, my eyes adjusting to the dark, and there in the doorway stood my mother. Her silhouette was motionless, the faint light from the hallway stretching her shadow across the floor. In her hand, she held the missing bulb. She stepped forward and placed it on the floor beside my bed. She didn't speak, didn't even glance at me. Then she turned and left, her movements strangely fluid, almost too quiet for the creaking floorboards beneath her. I waited a few minutes before following. The hallway was colder than my room, and a faint draft carried the smell of damp wood. I crept toward the sound of movement and saw her at the base of the attic ladder. Without hesitation, she climbed, her arms and legs bending in ways that made my stomach twist too wide, too quick, like her joints didn't work the same way mine did. She vanished into the dark above. I stayed at the bottom of the ladder, craning my neck to listen. At first, there was silence. Then came the sound of wet tearing noise, slow and deliberate, followed by a series of heavy thuds. Something scraped against the attic floor, dragging across it in long arcs. I stepped back, suddenly aware that if she came down and saw me here, I wouldn't be able to explain myself. She descended a few minutes later, her hands slick with something dark that caught the faint light in thin, sticky strands. She walked to the kitchen, her bare feet leaving no trace on the floor, and turned on the tap. She washed her hands in slow, deliberate motions, the water turning a faint reddish brown before disappearing down the drain. As she worked, she began to hum low, tuneless, almost mechanical. I hid in the hallway until she was done, waiting for her to leave the room. But when I finally stepped forward, something outside caught my eye. Through the thin curtain of the kitchen window, a pale shape stood in the yard. I moved closer, pressing my face to the glass. It was a face, hovering just above the window frame. Skin too pale, eyes too large and glossy, as if they were reflecting more light than they should. The mouth hung slightly open, unmoving. Its head tilted slowly to one side in a way that looked both curious and wrong, like it was testing how far it could go. I stumbled backward, hitting the wall. When I looked again, the face was gone. The yard was empty, the rain tapping steadily on the glass. I barely slept that night. Every sound outside seemed amplified: the wind in the trees, the faint patter of rain on the roof, and something else. Light, uneven footsteps circling the house. They moved from one wall to another, stopping for long moments, as if whoever it was had pressed themselves close to listen. When the steps finally stopped, I lay there for hours, waiting. The silence returned, heavy and absolute. It felt like the kind of silence that wasn't empty at all, but full of something just out of sight, something waiting for me to close my eyes. In the early hours before dawn, when the house was still and I thought maybe I could rest, there came a sound at my window. Not knocking, not scratching, just the soft drag of something across the glass, back and forth, like it was tracing the outline of the room from the outside. I knew I couldn't stay in the house anymore. Every night had been worse than the one before, and whatever my mother was doing in the attic wasn't meant for me to understand. It was meant for me to fear. I decided I would leave before dawn, when the woods outside were still dark, but the first pale light would be coming. I spent most of the night sitting on my bed, waiting. The scraping from the attic had started hours earlier, but it wasn't the usual slow, deliberate sound. Tonight it was faster, more agitated, like something was pacing just above my head. Once or twice, I thought I heard a low moan threaded between the scrapes, but the sound was so faint I couldn't be sure if it was real or something my mind was creating to fill the silence. When I finally moved, I did it quietly, slipping into the hallway with my bag already slung over my shoulder. The boards beneath my feet groaned, each sound louder than I wanted, but nothing stirred. I reached the back door and placed my hand on the cold metal handle. I was one breath away from pushing it open when a sudden, sharp sting pierced the side of my neck. The world tilted instantly. My vision blurred, and I felt my knees buckle. I tried to catch myself, but my body wasn't listening. My last sight before the dark took me was the shape of someone thin, hunched, standing behind me. When I woke, I couldn't move my arms or legs. My wrists and ankles were bound tightly, rough rope biting into my skin. The air around me was cold and thick with a smell of damp soil and rust. It took me only a few seconds to realize where I was: the basement room beneath my mother's closet. My back was pressed against the dirt wall, the single chair still in the center of the room, the same dark stain beneath it. Above me, faint but clear, came the sound of footsteps, 2 sets. One was my mother's slow, heavy tread, the other was lighter, quicker, and somehow uneven, as if the person or thing moving above was shifting weight from limb to limb in a way that wasn't quite human. The trapdoor creaked open, spilling weak light down the narrow staircase. My mother appeared, her face unreadable in the glow. She stood there for a moment, staring at me with those glassy eyes, and then stepped aside. Another figure moved into view behind her. It was a woman, Or at least it looked like one. Her skin was gray and tight against her bones, her hair long and wet, as though she had just climbed from a river. Her eyes were far too large, dark in the center with a thin, trembling ring of white around them. Her lips were colorless and pulled back slightly, revealing teeth that seemed too small and too many. She descended the stairs slowly, her limbs bending too far at the joints, each step silent, despite the old wood. My mother watched from above, her expression empty, her hands resting calmly at her sides. When the gray woman reached the bottom, she crouched in front of me, her face inches from mine. Her head tilted in that same curious, wrong way I had seen outside the window. She didn't blink. Her breath was damp and cold, smelling faintly of soil and something metallic. I turned my head away, but her hand cold and thin gripped my chin and forced me to look at her. She studied me for a long moment, her breathing quickening. And then she made a sound I will never forget, low wet rasp, like a laugh dragged across water. From above, my mother spoke in that same chanting tone I had heard in the attic. The gray woman's head snapped up, listening, then she rose to her full unnatural height and stepped back into the shadows of the room. The trapdoor above closed. The footsteps faded, and in the darkness I realized I was no longer alone. Something else was moving just behind me, pressing closer with every slow, deliberate breath.